The stranger at the gates. The storm raged over the Grand Caldwell estate, fierce and unrelenting. Snowflakes the size of feathers tumbled from the heavens, piling high against the wrought iron gates that loomed like the entrance to another world. The wind howled through the barren trees, rattling their frost-laced branches as if whispering secrets only the lonely would understand. Alexander Caldwell sat alone in his dining hall, his reflection distorted in the gleaming surface of the mahogany table. Before him, a decadent feast lay untouched, roast turkey glazed to perfection, steaming mashed potatoes dripping with melted butter, and candied yams that shimmered under the golden chandelier's light. The air was rich with cinnamon and roasted chestnuts, a scent meant to evoke warmth and holiday cheer. But in this house, it only amplified the silence. Alexander exhaled deeply, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. Bourbon. His only companion these days. He lifted it to his lips but hesitated, lost in the flickering firelight that danced across the walls. He had built this empire brick by brick, made his fortune with ruthless precision, but what did it matter? He had no one to share it with. His mansion, once filled with laughter and life, had become an empty monument to everything he had lost. Then, the sound came. A knocking. Not from the heavy oak doors at the main entrance, but from beyond the grand estate's iron gates. Alexander frowned. It was nearly midnight. The snowfall had made the roads nearly impassable. No one should be out there. And yet, the knocking continued, urgent, desperate. Annoyance prickled through him. He wasn't in the mood for interruptions, let alone charity. His security guards had the night off for the holiday, and he had no guests. Whoever was at the gate would soon realize no one was coming to their aid. But then, he heard something else. A voice. Faint. Shaking. Barely audible over the wind. Please, someone. A child. Alexander stiffened. Rising from his chair, he strode to the tall windows overlooking the front of the estate. Beyond the swirling snow, a small figure stood at the gates, gripping the iron bars with frail fingers. A child, hunched and shivering beneath a threadbare coat, his face half hidden by the hood. Something inside Alexander twisted. He could easily turn away. He had done it 100 times before, closing his doors to those in need, guarding his wealth as if it could shield him from his own mistakes. But this. There was something familiar about the boy. Shaking off the eerie feeling, Alexander grabbed his heavy wool coat and stepped into the frigid night. The moment he opened the grand double doors, the wind struck him like a knife, biting through his clothes and making his breath fog in the air. Snow crunched beneath his polished shoes as he walked down the long path toward the gates. The boy flinched at the sound of footsteps. His wide, dark eyes darted toward Alexander, filled with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. His cheeks were raw from the cold, his lips cracked. Snow clung to his too-thin coat, soaking through the tattered fabric. Alexander felt something stir deep in his chest. "Who are you?" he demanded. His voice came out harsher than he intended. The boy swallowed, his breath coming in ragged puffs. "Please, sir. I don't have anywhere to go." The words sent an unexpected pang through Alexander. The boy couldn't have been older than 10 or 11. He looked weak, exhausted. But that wasn't what unsettled him. It was his eyes. Those deep brown eyes, so hauntingly familiar. Alexander gritted his teeth. "How did you get here?" The boy hesitated, his small hands gripping the bars tighter. "I walked," he whispered. "I saw the lights. I thought maybe someone could help." Alexander's brow furrowed. In this storm? It was a miracle he hadn't collapsed in the snow. "And where are your parents?" he asked, though a gnawing dread already twisted in his gut. The boy looked down. Snowflakes clung to his long lashes. "My mother is gone." The answer made Alexander's breath hitch. He hadn't expected the sharp stab of sympathy that came with it. "And your father?" he pressed. Silence. Then, finally, the boy spoke. "I don't know him." The words sent a chill down Alexander's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He studied the boy more closely now, the shape of his face, the curve of his jaw, the way his lower lip trembled just slightly, the way his small fists clenched at his sides as if bracing himself for rejection. It couldn't be. It shouldn't be. Alexander's mouth was suddenly dry. He had spent years trying to bury his past, trying to forget the only woman who had ever truly mattered to him. The only woman he had loved. "What's your mother's name?" he asked, his voice quieter now. The boy hesitated, his gaze flickering up toward him. Then, in a voice barely louder than the wind, he said, "Evelyn Carter." Alexander's world tilted. The air left his lungs in a sharp exhale. No. It wasn't possible. But deep down, he knew. He knew the truth before the boy could say another word. Because Evelyn Carter was a name that had haunted him for over a decade. Evelyn Carter was the woman he had let slip away. The woman he had abandoned in his blind pursuit of success. And this boy, this freezing, shivering boy, was staring at him with her eyes. The sun he never knew existed. Ghosts of the past. The snowstorm raged on, but Alexander Caldwell no longer felt the cold. He stood frozen at the gates of his estate, his heartbeat hammering against his ribcage. Evelyn Carter. The name echoed in his mind like a ghostly whisper from a life he had long buried. His grip tightened on the iron bars, his knuckles white against the frost. His gaze locked onto the boy. His son, a child he had never known, a child left to fend for himself on a brutal winter night. It was impossible. And yet, there he was. The boy shifted, his small frame trembling violently beneath his thin coat. His lips were nearly blue, his hands stiff from the cold. He was barely holding himself upright, exhaustion and frostbite creeping in like silent assassins. Alexander forced himself to move. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a keyring with a steady hand that betrayed none of the turmoil raging inside him. He slid the heavy key into the lock of the gate, the metal creaking as he swung it open. The boy flinched as if he expected to be struck. The reaction sent an unexpected pang of guilt through Alexander's chest. "Come inside," he said, his voice quieter than before. The boy hesitated, his feet shifting against the snow-packed ground. "You're not going to send me away?" Something about the way he asked the question, so unsure, so accustomed to rejection, made Alexander's throat tighten. "No," he said, firmer this time. "Come." The boy hesitated only a moment longer before stepping forward. Alexander shut the gate behind them, the sound heavy in the silence between them. As they walked up the long path toward the mansion, Alexander stole glances at him. He was so small. Too thin. His shoes, if they could even be called that, were tattered beyond use, barely shielding his feet from the cold. His coat was equally ragged, more suited for autumn than a brutal winter night. How long had he been out there? How many nights had he endured like this? A lump formed in Alexander's throat. By the time they reached the grand double doors of the mansion, the boy was shivering uncontrollably. Alexander pushed open the doors, and a gust of warmth rushed out to meet them, carrying the scent of cinnamon and roasted chestnuts. The boy hesitated at the threshold. "It's okay," Alexander said. "Come in." With slow, cautious steps, the boy entered. His wide eyes darted around the massive entryway, the towering ceilings, the sweeping staircase, the golden chandeliers reflecting off the marble floors. His gaze flickered to the grand Christmas tree in the main hall, its lights twinkling like stars against the velvet darkness of the room. Alexander watched him, his chest tightening. When was the last time this boy had seen a Christmas tree? Had he ever? He cleared his throat. "Let's get you warmed up." The boy didn't move at first, as if unsure whether to trust him. But when another violent shiver racked his small frame, he nodded. Alexander led him through the grand hall, past paintings worth more than most people made in a lifetime, past silent corridors lined with doors that had been shut for years. He brought him to the sitting room, where a grand fireplace blazed against the cold night. The flames cast golden shadows along the walls, flickering in patterns that reminded Alexander of memories he had tried to forget. He gestured toward the plush armchair nearest the fire. "Sit," he said. The boy hesitated before sinking into the chair. He held out his trembling hands toward the flames, his fingers stiff and red from the cold. Alexander shrugged off his heavy wool coat and draped it over the boy's shoulders. It swallowed him whole, but at least it would keep him warm. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Alexander spoke. "How long have you been out there?" The boy didn't look at him. He stared into the fire as if searching for answers in the flames. "A while," he said softly. Alexander frowned. "What does that mean? Hours? Days?" The boy's fingers clenched into fists. "A few days." Alexander inhaled sharply. Days. A child, his child, had been out on the streets, alone, in the freezing cold, with no one to care for him. His jaw tightened. "Where have you been staying?" "Nowhere." The boy shifted uncomfortably. "Just, wherever I could." The words sliced through Alexander like a blade. He had spent the past decade building an empire of wealth and power, but his own flesh and blood had been struggling to survive on the streets. He swallowed the guilt threatening to consume him. "And your mother?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The boy flinched at the mention of her. His gaze dropped to the oversized sleeves of the coat now draped around him. "She got sick," he said, voice barely above a whisper. And then, she was gone. The air in the room grew impossibly heavy. Alexander's chest constricted. Evelyn Carter. Gone. The woman who had once meant everything to him. The woman he had loved and lost. He gripped the edge of the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "What happened to you after that?" His voice was careful now, measured. The boy hesitated, as if debating whether to answer. But then he sighed, as if too exhausted to hold the words back any longer. "I tried to stay where we lived, but they said I couldn't." "Who said?" "The landlord. He said kids can't live alone." "Of course." Alexander clenched his jaw. He could already see how it had unfolded. Evelyn had died, leaving her son, their son, with nowhere to go. The landlord had likely thrown him out, unwilling to deal with an orphan child. "And no one took you in?" The boy shook his head. I didn't want to go to one of those places." "What places?" "The ones where they put kids without parents. The ones where you get lost." The way he said it made Alexander's stomach twist. He had been alone all this time. Alone. In the freezing cold. In a world that had discarded him like nothing more than an afterthought. The weight of it all crashed down on Alexander like a landslide. He had been so consumed with his success, so blinded by his own ambition, that he had let Evelyn slip away. And now, she was gone forever. And the son he had never known was sitting before him, half frozen and abandoned by the world. His fingers curled into fists. He had spent his life making ruthless decisions, severing anything that stood in the way of his goals. But for the first time in years, he realized just how much those choices had cost him. He had lost the woman he loved. And nearly lost his son before he even knew he existed. Alexander exhaled, steadying himself. He had made a lifetime of mistakes. But this, he could still change. He stood, reaching for the bell near the fireplace. A moment later, the housekeeper, Mrs. Hensley, appeared, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the boy. "Run a hot bath," Alexander said, his voice firm. "And bring him some proper clothes. Make sure he's warm." The boy's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "You're not sending me away?" he asked cautiously. Alexander met his gaze. "No," he said. "I'm not." Because this time, he was not walking away. This time, he was going to do what he should have done years ago. He was going to be a father. A father's redemption. The boy hesitated, his weary eyes flickering with something between uncertainty and hope. Alexander watched him closely, reading every slight movement, the way his fingers curled into the thick wool coat, the way his shoulders tensed at the sound of footsteps echoing through the grand halls, the way he barely allowed himself to believe in warmth, in comfort. How long has this child been without kindness? Mrs. Hensley, the housekeeper who had been with Alexander for over 2 decades, arrived quickly, her silver hair pulled into its usual neat bun. She had seen the boy sitting by the fire and instantly softened, her sharp eyes filling with quiet concern. "A hot bath is being prepared," she informed Alexander, though her gaze remained fixed on the boy. The boy looked down at the marble floor, as if he didn't belong. Mrs. Hensley smiled gently. "Come with me, dear. Let's get you warm and cleaned up." For a moment, the boy hesitated. Then, slowly, he stood, still wrapped in Alexander's coat, and followed her down the hall. Alexander remained near the fireplace, staring into the flames, his mind racing. How had it come to this? He had once imagined a different life with Evelyn. A life where he had put love before ambition, where he had chosen her over everything else. But that wasn't the path he had taken. Instead, he had built an empire. And in doing so, he had left behind the one person who had ever truly loved him. His jaw clenched as he walked toward the grand liquor cabinet in the corner of the room. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal glass. He took a sip, but it did nothing to drown the guilt curdling in his stomach. A child. His child. Out in the freezing cold, alone. Alexander exhaled sharply, gripping the glass tighter. He had always told himself that he wasn't meant for family, that he wasn't built for love. But now, the very evidence of his failure sat under his roof, a boy with Evelyn's eyes and a past he didn't yet fully understand. He needed answers. He needed to know everything about what had happened to Evelyn, and what had led this child to his doorstep. And above all, he needed to make things right. A new beginning. The bathwater steamed, the scent of lavender and chamomile filling the air as the boy slowly lowered himself into the warmth. It had been so long since he'd felt this kind of comfort. The heat burned against his frozen skin at first, but then it melted into something soothing. Mrs. Hensley handed him a soft washcloth and a bar of fresh soap. "You take your time, dear," she said kindly. "There's no rush." The boy nodded, but inside, he was still hesitant. Why was this happening? Why had the man at the gate, his father, decided to help him? He hadn't expected kindness. He had expected the same thing he always received, cold indifference. Rejection. But instead, he was here, in a house so big it felt like a castle, soaking in a warm bath with clean towels waiting for him. Could he trust it? Could he trust him? As he scrubbed away the layers of dirt, he looked at himself in the rippling water. Beneath the grime, beneath the exhaustion, he could see glimpses of his mother's face staring back at him. And that reminder gave him strength. She had always told him stories about his father. About the life they could have had. But her stories were always tinged with sadness, with a pain she never fully explained. Had she ever wanted him to meet his father? Had she believed, even in her final days, that he would? The boy swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the edge of the tub. Maybe this was fate. Maybe, just maybe, this was what his mother had wanted all along. An unspoken connection. When the boy emerged from the bath, his cheeks were flushed from the warmth. Mrs. Hensley had laid out fresh clothes, a pair of soft cotton pajamas and a thick robe to keep him warm. For the first time in weeks, he felt safe. She led him back down the long hallway toward the dining room, where Alexander was waiting. The grand feast from earlier still sat untouched, the once hot food now cooled but still as extravagant as ever. The boy hesitated at the entrance. Alexander stood and gestured toward the long table. "Come, sit." The boy walked forward slowly, climbing into one of the massive chairs. Alexander sat across from him, watching him closely. Then, he reached for a dish and began to fill a plate. Warm roasted turkey, soft mashed potatoes, buttered rolls. He slid the plate toward the boy. "You should eat." The boy eyed the food cautiously. He had learned to be wary of gifts, of offers that came with hidden prices. Alexander seemed to read his mind. "There are no conditions," he said. "No catch. Just eat." The boy picked up a fork and took a slow bite. The moment the food hit his tongue, he nearly melted. It was rich, savory, better than anything he'd had in as long as he could remember. He ate in silence, not knowing what to say. Alexander, too, remained quiet at first, watching him, taking in the way he held himself, the way his eyes scanned the room as if memorizing every detail. Finally, he spoke. "Your mother never told me about you." The boy paused mid-bite, his gaze flickering up. Alexander continued. "I didn't know I had a son." The boy swallowed hard, setting his fork down. He shifted in his seat. "She never talked about you much." A sharp pain lanced through Alexander's chest. "Why?" The boy hesitated. "She was sad about you." Alexander stiffened. "She told me that once, a long time ago, you loved her. But that you left." Alexander exhaled. He had expected as much. Evelyn had been right to hate him, to resent him for walking away. He ran a hand through his hair. "I did love her," he admitted, his voice quieter. "More than anything. But I made mistakes. And I let my ambition take me away from what truly mattered." The boy watched him carefully. "I don't expect you to understand, or to forgive me," Alexander continued. "But I want you to know, I regret it. Every day." Silence stretched between them. The fire crackled in the background, casting warm light over their faces. The boy bit his lip, then asked softly, "Why did you help me?" Alexander's throat tightened. "Because the moment I saw you, I knew," he said. "I knew you were mine. And no child, especially my child, should ever be left out in the cold." The boy's eyes shone, something fragile and uncertain behind them. For the first time that night, he didn't look like a lost boy. He looked like a son searching for something he had never had before. A family. And Alexander, for the first time in his life, was willing to fight for it. A father's burden. The fire crackled softly, its warmth casting long shadows against the walls of the grand dining hall. The boy sat across from Alexander, his plate half empty, but his appetite had waned. The weight of their conversation still lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Alexander leaned forward slightly, studying the boy's features in the dim firelight. His son. The thought still felt surreal. "What's your name?" Alexander asked at last, his voice quieter now. The boy hesitated, shifting in his seat. He had grown used to people not asking, not caring. But now, for the first time in a long time, someone wanted to know. "Gabriel," he said. Alexander's breath hitched. Gabriel. The name wasn't unfamiliar to him. Evelyn had once mentioned wanting to name a son that if they ever had one. She had chosen it, even without him. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, letting the pain of that realization settle before he opened them again. He looked at Gabriel with a newfound sense of responsibility. "You must have been through a lot," he said. Gabriel swallowed, gripping the edge of the table. "My mother died last year." His voice was almost too quiet to hear. Alexander felt a pang deep in his chest. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed was different. "How?" Gabriel's fingers tightened around the napkin in his lap. "She got sick. We didn't have money for the hospital. By the time we did, it was too late." Alexander's jaw clenched. Guilt, sharp and unforgiving, pressed against him like a crushing weight. He had more money than he could ever spend in a lifetime, and yet, the woman he had once loved had died because of something as cruel as poverty. And worse, his own son had suffered because of it. Gabriel continued, his voice carrying a quiet resilience. "After she died, I tried to stay at the shelter, but it was full most nights. I slept outside, in alleys, wherever I could. Then, when it got really cold, I remembered what she told me." Alexander furrowed his brows. "What did she tell you?" Gabriel's gaze lifted, locking onto his. "That my father was rich. That if I ever had nowhere to go, I should find you." A lump formed in Alexander's throat. Evelyn had still believed in him. Even after everything, she had still told their son to come to him in his darkest moment. But he had almost turned him away. The thought sickened him. "I'm so sorry, Gabriel," Alexander murmured. "For everything." Gabriel didn't respond right away. He just sat there, watching him, as if trying to determine whether he was truly sorry, or if this was just another disappointment waiting to happen. Alexander didn't blame him for the hesitation. "I don't know if I should trust you," Gabriel admitted. "You weren't there for my mom. And you weren't there for me." Alexander inhaled sharply. The words cut deep, but they were true. "I know," he said. "And I won't ask you to forgive me right away. But if you let me, I'd like to try." Gabriel looked down at his plate, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. "You mean that?" he asked, voice quieter now. Alexander nodded. "I do." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Gabriel gave a small nod. It wasn't much. But it was a start. The weight of the past. That night, Alexander lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He had never struggled to sleep before, not in all his years of building his empire, not even on the loneliest of nights. But tonight was different. His son, the boy he never knew existed, was sleeping just down the hall. And Evelyn was gone. The regret he had buried for years rose to the surface, relentless and suffocating. He had been young when he left her, so blinded by ambition that he hadn't realized what he was throwing away. He had told himself for years that it had been the right choice. That he wasn't meant for love. That she would be better off without him. But she hadn't been. And neither had their son. Alexander exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. For the first time in years, he wished he could rewrite the past. But he couldn't. The only thing he could do now was fix the future. And that started with Gabriel. A new morning. When Gabriel awoke the next morning, he almost didn't recognize where he was. For a moment, he thought it had all been a dream, the fire, the warmth, the food. But when he sat up, the thick blankets wrapped around him and the faint smell of fresh bread drifting through the air told him otherwise. He got up hesitantly, padding toward the grand hallway outside his room. He had never been in a house this big before. It was like something out of a movie, ornate chandeliers, tall ceilings, endless halls lined with paintings. It didn't feel real. Following the scent of breakfast, he made his way downstairs to the dining hall. Alexander was already there, sitting at the table, reading the morning newspaper. Mrs. Hensley was bustling around, setting out warm croissants, scrambled eggs, and freshly squeezed orange juice. "Good morning, dear," she greeted Gabriel with a kind smile. "Did you sleep well?" Gabriel nodded cautiously. "Yeah. I think so." She chuckled. "Well, come sit. Eat while it's hot." He sat down, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he had breakfast at a real table. Alexander put down his newspaper and studied Gabriel. "I was thinking," he said. "If you'd like, we could get you some new clothes today. And, maybe talk about what happens next." Gabriel hesitated. "What happens next?" he echoed. Alexander set his hands on the table, his expression softening. "That's up to you." Gabriel frowned slightly, pushing a piece of his scrambled eggs around his plate with his fork. "You're saying I can leave?" "If that's what you want," Alexander said. "I won't force you to stay. But I'd like for you to." Gabriel didn't respond right away. For so long, he had felt unwanted. Like he didn't belong anywhere. But here, in this house, for the first time in forever, he felt seen. Maybe it was worth giving a chance. Slowly, he nodded. I think I'd like to stay." Alexander's shoulders relaxed. "Then stay you shall." Mrs. Hensley smiled from the kitchen. For the first time in years, the grand house no longer felt empty. The road to redemption. The morning light filtered through the grand windows of the Whitaker estate, casting a golden glow on the marble floors. The house, once a cold and empty fortress, now hummed with the quiet presence of something new, something fragile but unmistakably real. Gabriel sat at the long dining table, his plate half empty, though his appetite was better than the night before. He still wasn't used to warm meals served on delicate china, nor the crisp linen napkins folded beside his plate. Across from him, Alexander sipped his coffee, his gaze thoughtful. "We'll go into town today," Alexander said, setting his cup down. "Get you some proper clothes, maybe a haircut if you'd like." Gabriel hesitated, glancing down at himself. His clothes were threadbare, his shoes barely holding together. He had been used to people ignoring him on the streets, but now, sitting here, he suddenly felt seen, and it made him self-conscious. "You don't have to buy me anything," Gabriel muttered, pushing his eggs around his plate with his fork. "I want to," Alexander said simply. Gabriel looked up, studying him. There was no pity in his eyes, just something else. Something heavier. Before Gabriel could say anything else, Mrs. Hensley bustled in with a fresh basket of croissants, setting them down with a warm smile. "You'll need a good breakfast before heading out," she said cheerfully. "You don't want to shop on an empty stomach." Gabriel glanced at Alexander again before hesitantly reaching for a croissant. He took a slow bite, still adjusting to the idea that food would be available whenever he was hungry. For so long, hunger had been his constant companion. Now, for the first time in a long time, he felt full. A walk through the past. The town square was buzzing with life. The air was crisp with the scent of fresh snow, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled the streets. Christmas decorations adorned the shop windows, twinkling with festive cheer. Gabriel walked beside Alexander, his hands stuffed into the pockets of the borrowed coat Mrs. Hensley had given him. It was warm, warmer than anything he'd worn in months. Alexander walked at a steady pace, nodding politely at those who greeted him. It was clear he was well known in town. People whispered his name as he passed, a new beginning. The snow had thickened as Alexander and Gabriel approached the grand Whitaker estate, their breath forming misty clouds in the cold evening air. The mansion loomed ahead, its towering walls no longer just a symbol of wealth and power, but of a past riddled with mistakes Alexander was determined to correct. As they stepped onto the front steps, the heavy wooden doors swung open. Mrs. Hensley stood there, her warm eyes flickering between them. "Welcome back, sirs," she said, but her gaze lingered on Gabriel with quiet approval. Gabriel nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Though he was still uneasy in this new life, something about Mrs. Hensley made him feel less like an outsider. The warmth of the mansion enveloped them as they entered. The golden glow from the chandeliers cast soft shadows across the walls, and the scent of cinnamon and fresh-baked bread lingered in the air. Gabriel set down the bags of new clothes, glancing around the grand foyer. It still felt surreal, being here, wearing warm clothes, knowing he had a place to sleep tonight that wasn't a park bench or a cold alleyway. Alexander removed his coat and handed it to Mrs. Hensley before turning to his son. "Would you like some hot chocolate?" he asked. Gabriel hesitated. Simple kindness still caught him off guard. "Sure," he said finally. Alexander nodded and gestured for him to follow. They walked through the hallways, past towering bookshelves and ornate portraits, until they reached the study. A fire crackled in the massive fireplace, casting flickering shadows against the leather-bound books that lined the walls. Alexander motioned for Gabriel to sit while he poured 2 cups of hot chocolate from a silver tray. He handed one to his son before sitting across from him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they sat in silence, the fire's warmth filling the space between them. Finally, Gabriel spoke. "Why didn't you come looking for me?" Alexander exhaled slowly, setting his cup down. He had expected the question. "I thought you were safe," he admitted. "Your mother, she never told me where she went. I tried to find her, but when she disappeared, I convinced myself that perhaps she wanted it that way. That she had moved on, found happiness elsewhere." Gabriel's fingers tightened around his cup. "She didn't move on," he said. "She struggled. She worked 2 jobs just to keep us fed. She got sick, but she still put me first." His voice wavered, but he forced himself to continue. "She never stopped waiting for you. She believed you'd come back one day." Alexander's jaw clenched. The weight of his past decisions pressed heavily against him. "I failed her," he murmured. "And I failed you." Gabriel looked away, his heart pounding. Part of him wanted to yell, to tell this man that sorry wasn't enough. That nothing could bring back the years he spent cold, hungry, and alone. But another part of him, the part that had spent nights staring at the stars, wondering if his father ever thought about him, wanted to believe that this man did regret everything. And that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Facing the ghosts of the past. Later that evening, Alexander led Gabriel to a room at the end of the hall. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a space bathed in soft light. Gabriel stepped inside, his breath catching. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with children's stories, adventure novels, and classic literature. A large bed with thick, soft blankets sat against the far wall, and an old rocking horse rested near the window. But what caught Gabriel's attention most was the small wooden train set on a shelf above the desk. He walked over, hesitantly reaching for it. "I had one just like this," he whispered. Alexander stood in the doorway, his eyes heavy with emotion. "You did," he said softly. "I bought this for you before you were born. I always imagined you playing with it one day." Gabriel swallowed hard. He had spent so many years believing he was unwanted. That his father had never cared. Yet this room, this untouched space, told a different story. Alexander had prepared for him. Had wanted him. But he had let fear and ambition drive him away. Gabriel turned to face him. "You kept this room for me?" Alexander nodded. "I couldn't bring myself to change it. Even when I convinced myself you were gone forever, I..." He paused, his voice thick. "I guess a part of me never let go." Gabriel clenched his fists. The pain of abandonment still lingered, but for the first time, he saw cracks in the wall of resentment he had built around himself. His father hadn't forgotten him. And maybe, just maybe, there was room for something new to grow between them. The Christmas that changed everything. That night, as the snow continued to fall outside, Gabriel lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The mansion was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors and the distant crackling of the fireplace downstairs. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of what tomorrow would bring. He had a roof over his head. A warm bed. Clothes that fit. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. Downstairs, Alexander sat in his study, staring at the old photographs of Gabriel's mother. His fingers traced the edges of a worn-out picture of Evelyn holding their newborn son. Tears welled in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." He didn't know if he would ever fully make up for the past. But as he looked at the second chance sleeping under his roof, he made a silent promise. He would spend the rest of his life proving to Gabriel that he wasn't alone anymore. And this time, he would never walk away again. Epilogue, A Father's Redemption. Christmas morning arrived with the soft chime of bells in the distance. Gabriel woke to the scent of fresh pancakes wafting through the air. He blinked, momentarily disoriented, before remembering where he was. For a brief, terrifying moment, he wondered if it had all been a dream. But then he saw the room around him, the warm blankets wrapped around his body, and the old wooden train sitting on his nightstand. It was real. He got up, padding downstairs in his new slippers. Alexander stood in the kitchen, flipping pancakes with a clumsy but determined effort. Mrs. Hensley watched with an amused smile, arms crossed. "You're terrible at this," she teased. Alexander chuckled. "I'm trying." Gabriel hesitated in the doorway. Alexander turned and saw him. "Merry Christmas," he said, a little unsure, but hopeful. Gabriel looked at the steaming stack of pancakes. It was such a simple thing. But to him, it meant everything. A lump formed in his throat. He didn't know if he could fully forgive his father yet. But as he stepped into the kitchen and took a seat at the table, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was a start.